Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the April 20th, 8:30 a.m. Project Homekey 2.0 info session. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague at the county, Carrie Sager.
Unmute myself makes it work a little better. Thank you all for joining us this morning. So many of you have probably heard about California's Project Homekey, which is a state program designed to create, basically using COVID funding to create new housing by acquiring buildings, either motels or commercial buildings, and turning them into permanent housing. So the first round of Homekey launched last summer. In that, Marin successfully acquired 2 properties, one of them in Corte, Madera, and one in San Rafael. Both of those properties are currently operating as interim housing for people who are on their way to permanent housing to keep them off the streets. And then they're going to be converted into permanent units, which is going to result in 66 new units of permanent supportive housing in Marin. In the governor's proposed budget, he's requested a second round of funding, an additional $750 million for Homekey. And in anticipation of the possibility that his request is fulfilled by the legislature, we're trying to get as prepared as possible ahead of time. And that is the goal of this morning's session. So in our last homeless count in January 2019, there were over 1,000 residents of Marin experiencing homelessness. And Project Homekey is essentially a program that gives us a chance to attain the most elusive ingredient to ending their homelessness, which is units of housing. Many of you are probably seeing, noticing, or even experiencing homelessness more since the start of the pandemic. The great majority of the people experiencing homelessness in Marin have been homeless in Marin for a long time. Many have disabilities and need a permanent home combined with supportive services to remain stably housed. And Project Homekey is a great way to make a major dent in homelessness. So we're here tonight, this morning, to have a discussion with you as a way to get ready for this funding opportunity. Marin was one of the only counties in California to reduce chronic homelessness from 2017 to 2019. And over the past year, we've accelerated our success in finding houses for those experiencing homelessness by 46%. And the way we did that is basically through permanent housing, just like Homekey. In 2015, our system in Marin had 193 units of permanent supportive housing. As of January 2020, we were up to 514 units. And since then, we've added an additional 75 through the use of federal mainstream vouchers. As a result, today we're up to 589 permanent supportive housing units. So from 193 to 589 in 6 years, that's basically tripling our permanent supportive housing stock. We did this by launching Whole Person Care, which provides intensive client-centered services, getting all the homeless providers working together, and by having a super innovative housing authority. So that's just a little background. Now I'm going to turn it over to Andrew. So Andrew's with Opening Doors, which is a private-public partnership of funders and policymakers from across Marin dedicated to ending chronic and veteran homelessness. And Andrew is the organization's project director. So over to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Carrie. Good morning, everyone. We have a presentation for you this morning, so I'm going to go ahead and share screen here. I'm getting my screen up now. I want to thank you for taking the time out of your morning to come join us today and learn more about this program. So you heard a little bit already from Carrie. And again, I'm Andrew Henning with Opening Doors. We have our contact information right here if you'd like to reach out. Carrie, maybe if you want to drop this information in the chat would be really helpful. And yeah, if there are any questions or comments that you have that come up later or that you don't feel comfortable asking in the group, feel free to reach out directly to us at any time. In terms of the basically some housekeeping for today, just so you know, I announced earlier, I don't know if more people trickled in, but this is being recorded. All sessions are being recorded, and I'll be sending out a link so that you can see all 10 of the sessions if you were curious to see other sessions and some of the Q&A from them. But just wanted to give everyone a heads up on that. We do have a presentation. Following the presentation, there'll be time for a Q&A that we'll be doing through the chat. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop them into the chat or the Q&A function that Zoom has. Either one works. And then also we'll be providing a link to a feedback survey for actually getting your feedback and then any ideas you might have for Homekey projects. But I'll explain that more when we get to it. We are going to talk briefly about a little bit about homelessness in Marin, but I did want to say that this presentation is primarily about Homekey 2.0. We're not going to go too much into homelessness overall, but I will give a kind of a high level overview to build on what Carrie shared. And then while I don't think it's likely at this point, in case we're Zoom bombed or some other weird technical thing happens, I do have everyone's email address. And so I can follow up afterwards if we need to end the session earlier, if there's a technical problem, and we can schedule another session, no problem. And then lastly, there'll be a lot of information today, but I just wanted to share the county has put together this website, marincounty.org/main/homekey. You can also just Google Marin County Homekey, and it should be a top result. And they have a lot of great information about Homekey 1.0 as well as Homekey 2.0. For our agenda today, we're already doing welcome and introductions, but like I said, we're going to do a brief overview of homelessness in Marin, as well as a little bit of an overview of what Opening Doors Marin is and how those things are connected. But most of the presentation will really be about Homekey and your questions related to Homekey. So diving right in, I do like to preface that I have a probably 45-minute version of this presentation. So I'm giving you the 5-minute kind of primer. So if you have more questions, feel free to reach out through the email addresses that we shared. But basically, as Carrie said, a lot of our systems transformation around homelessness really began in 2016. And there are a lot of reasons for this, but it began with kind of a core, simple insight, which was that most of our challenges related to homelessness were stemming from a small group of people experiencing chronic homelessness. And what I mean by that is that if you look at the spectrum of people experiencing homelessness, from those who are the majority, who are actually only briefly homeless for a few weeks or months, to people who are long-term chronically homeless, we find that public costs, so let's say EMS transport, emergency room visits, other emergency public safety interventions, those costs rise exponentially as people enter chronic homelessness. And studies both locally and around the country have found that the per capita cost of someone remaining chronically homeless can be over $60,000 per year. And a big part of that is that just morally, ethically, these folks are also some of the most vulnerable in our community. People experiencing chronic homelessness pass away on average 25 years earlier than their housed peers, not from a single night of cold weather, but from long-term chronic health issues that go unaddressed and untreated. So both, I think, economically and morally, we realized that this was a huge problem. And the issue, though, unfortunately, was that we had a lot of great programs and services, but they weren't necessarily focused on this part of the curve, the people experiencing chronic homelessness. So back in 2015-16, we hit the road when we started to realize that this was the core challenge for us. We went up to Sonoma County, to the East Bay, down to Silicon Valley. We took our elected leaders. You can see Carrie here as well. I like doing these presentations with someone that was in these pictures. And we really learned, what are other communities doing to address homelessness? And at the same time, we also started to map our own local system of care. And so here you can see on this map, it's more important to, I think, see the connections, but in the middle is being homeless, and then being housed is on the outside. And we had created a well-intentioned system of care, but it was kind of a maze, and it was very difficult for people to navigate. And so a lot of people that were homeless were not making it to housing, especially people that were chronically homeless. And the real cycle that was at play was that we had people that were inherently challenging to serve because of underlying health issues, behavioral health issues, traumatic brain injuries, substance abuse disorders, often many of these challenges together at the same time. And again, we had a lot of programs, but people were failing out of these programs. They became more distrustful of the system. They didn't seek help, and then their situation got worse. And so when we really started this change process, there were people who had been homeless in our community for, in some cases, 20, 30, even 40 years, stuck in this cycle, which wasn't working for them, and it wasn't working for the community. And so what we realized from all of our field trips and our tours is that we didn't need just a new program. We didn't need, let's say, like a substance abuse program. We needed a new process for recognizing the unique needs of each of these individuals. And ultimately, we decided to pilot a program called the Homeless Outreach Team, or the HOT program, which we had discovered in San Mateo. And this program, both in San Mateo and locally, has been named now a statewide best practice by the League of California Cities. And we started this in March of 2016 as a pilot in San Rafael. And basically what we did is we got all of our partners together, our service providers, the city, the county, and we came up with a binding list of the 12 most visible, vulnerable, chronically homeless people in downtown San Rafael. And we basically said, if we can't get these folks housed, what are we doing? And so we met every 2 weeks, we took actions, and we really focused on getting them housed. And the result was that because of something that we learned about called housing first, where instead of having people navigate this maze of services, you take them directly into housing with supportive services. We realized that this practice, this methodology was 200, 300% more effective than the status quo that we've been pursuing. And not surprisingly, we started to see some amazing results. We started housing people that we thought we could never house again. And so for the first 18 months of that program, we housed 23 of the most visible, vulnerable, chronically homeless people in San Rafael. And so with that success, that pilot success in 2017, in fact, October 1st of 2017, we said, can we actually turn this into a county-wide strategy? And thanks to the help of, if you were on earlier, you might have heard Carrie and I talking about this Build for Zero organization, or Build for Zero is the movement, Community Solutions is the organization. But it's this organization nationally that's helping communities all across the country and Canada basically scale up this kind of binding list methodology for solving chronic homelessness, veteran homelessness. And they just got a huge grant from the MacArthur Foundation for their work. And this helped us really realize that this hot program that we started could become a much bigger thing. And so the result was that after launching this system, as Carrie said, we've been adding more permanent supportive housing every year. And from 2017 to 2019, we had an almost 30% reduction in chronic homelessness. Since October of 2017, we've now housed over 320 of the most visible, vulnerable, chronically homeless people throughout Marin County. And while this stat on the left here is a little bit outdated, our retention rate unfortunately has fallen to 94%. That's actually still higher than the national average of about 85%. We've had incredible retention in our programs. And the result is that it's really met our kind of original hypotheses about what this would do. And that, at least from data we have from San Rafael, we've seen huge reductions in police interventions for people, criminal justice interventions, as well as EMS transports or other emergency interventions like that. So it really has been a real positive for our community. So the question I often get is how? How are you doing this? How are you housing people? And amazingly, most of the people that we're housing are in scattered site rental units throughout the county. We've housed people from Mill Valley to Novato, Larkspur, all the way out to Inverness, in these scattered site units. So what that means is that there are currently, and Carrie said, in tripling our permanent supportive housing stock, those folks are scattered throughout the entire county. They're already in our communities. And I think what's great about this is, if you haven't noticed, that is actually not surprising, because this housing and service combination really helps people thrive in housing. And so that's really what our goal has been. But we can't be 100% reliant on just landlords. And so we've also, over the past few years, been trying to work to create actual new units. So you can see here, this was a project in in Fairfax called Victory Village for seniors. We were able to carve out some of these units for permanent supportive housing for our folks. And then right now in San Rafael, as another example, Homeward Bound is currently rebuilding the Mill Street shelter to be 32 new units of permanent supportive housing, plus the original shelter capacity. So this is another great, actual built project. And that segues to opening doors. So in the early days of this change process, as early as, I think it was really the end of 2016, but we really started meeting in 2017, we formed this group that I helped co-found with some other local leaders, including the county, that we called the Marin Chronic Homeless Action Task Force, or MCHAT for short. And for the first 2 years of MCHAT's convening, it was mainly based on stakeholder education and alignment. So we pulled together county leaders, city leaders, business leaders, the faith-based community, philanthropy, and we're really educating them on Built for Zero, on the by name list, on housing first. And ultimately, at the end of 2018, we realized that if our group wanted to have an impact, our biggest value add could be around housing, specifically coming up with local capital. And what I mean by that is simply local funding for housing. We had realized that there are actually a lot of opportunities to pursue housing in our community. We just need the money to be able to do so. And so in early 2019, MCHAT rebranded itself as Opening Doors Marin, became a 501c3 fiscally sponsored project under the Center for Volunteer and Nonprofit Leadership. And in 2019, we spent almost the entirety of that year exploring the feasibility of a public revenue measure for housing. This is something that counties around us and throughout the state have passed in order to have local capital for pursuing housing that they want to pursue. And I think what we learned through our polling and our focus groups, and I think what we also know in general, is that in Marin, we really value local control over the type of housing and the type of programs and housing that we have in our community. And so this would have been a great way to actually advance and accelerate that local control. However, ultimately, there wasn't enough political support for something like this. And so in early 2020, we shifted our focus to using the data that we have to build out what we call a community business plan. So really, what are the exact numbers that we're projecting for the number of units we need, how many services we need to end chronic and veteran homelessness? And that was the plan, at least prior to the pandemic. Before shifting to Homekey, which is really what Opening Doors spent a lot of last year working on, I did just want to say, if you're curious about this model, I would encourage you to check out an organization called Destination Home. They're probably 10 years ahead of where Opening Doors is, but they're a Silicon Valley-based public-private partnership, 501c3, that's also working to create more permanent supportive housing in Santa Clara County. They've helped pass a public revenue measure. And then they also have pulled in a lot of philanthropic giving from the tech sector. So they're really trying to bring a lot of that local money to create more housing and services for people. So if you're interested, I would encourage you to check out a little bit more about Destination Home. But again, our presentation today is really about Homekey 1.0. And in order to understand Homekey 1.0, we need to talk a little bit about the confusingly named predecessor, Project Roomkey. And so basically, right after shelter in place started in March of last year, the state quickly rolled out a program called Project Roomkey. And the county deserves a lot of credit because this was done through originally a disaster service worker model. But basically, the idea was that because of all these underlying health issues that I talked about earlier within the homeless community, COVID was seen as a particularly dangerous threat to people experiencing homelessness. And so the state basically provided funding to local communities to lease hotel and motel rooms to create non-congregate shelter. So congregate shelter by comparison would be like a gymnasium with a bunch of cots in it. Obviously, that's not a good environment for COVID. And so across the state, thanks to Project Roomkey, almost 22,000 people were able to come off the street. Almost every county, even including a couple tribal governments, participated in this. So it was honestly a real success at getting a lot of people off the street quickly. And because of that, within a few short months, in fact, in June of last year, the state announced a new program called Project Homekey, which was a reallocation of federal coronavirus relief funding. And so we heard about this in June. The state came out with a notice of funding availability in July, and applications were due less than a month later. So very rapid announcement, very rapid turnaround. But the idea with the funding was that it could be used for the acquisition and adaptive reuse of buildings, including hotels, motels, commercial buildings. But the catch was that because they were repurposing federal money, which was basically use it or lose it by the end of the year, the idea was that these buildings have to be acquired by the end of the calendar year, and they have to be at least 50% operational within 90 days. And despite these constraints across the state, Homekey resulted in almost 6,000 units, or approximately 6,000 units that served over 9,000 people. So when you think about the fact that there are 150,000 people that are homeless in California at any given time, this really made a huge difference to ending homelessness throughout the state. So locally, we had two successful Project Homekey projects. One was 3301 Kerner, which is was an office building in San Rafael, and that'll create 44 new units of permanent supportive housing. And then there's also the Casa Buena, which was a former motel in Corte, Madera, right next to Marin Joe's, which created 18 units of housing plus a manager's unit. And I wanted to really spend a moment to talk a little bit about the Casa Buena, because I just wanted to acknowledge up front that, first and foremost, this process happened way faster than any of us would ever really have imagined. Typically, a housing development or affordable housing project takes many years in terms of conceptualizing, getting the funding, getting planning commission buy-in, city council buy-in. And this happened obviously within a few short months. And so there was a lot of, I think, trepidation, understandably, from community members about, is this actually a good idea? Can this work? Is this going to work? And so the town of Corte Madera, which I think deserves a lot of credit for this, ended up forming a community advisory committee in response to this Project Homekey site in their community. And Opening Doors has been helping to facilitate that group. In fact, just last night, we hosted a community forum about the project. And the committee has been working on items ranging from success metrics and evaluation, exterior redesign to comply with neighborhood desires, as well as to make sure that it's an inviting environment for people that live there. And then also really making sure that the community engagement is in a good place. And so that group has put together a virtual ribbon cutting video. So I just wanted to show you this because I think it really encapsulates what could be possible with the Project Homekey site. So I'm going to play this video now.
On behalf of Corte Madera's elected officials, staff, and residents, I'd like to welcome you to the Casa Buena, Corte Madera's first permanent supportive housing for those that experience homelessness. This was all brought together by a collaborative effort that included the County of Marin, Catholic Charities, Open Door Marin, town staff, and Corte Madera residents, who are also providing monetary and in-kind donations.
Marin has worked very hard over the past 3 years to address our homeless population. And with the Homekey project in Corte Madera at Casa Buena, we will be able to provide needed housing for 18 of our most vulnerable residents while wrapping all the services the county has to offer around them. I want to thank the community of Corte Madera, their city council, and the Casa Buena Steering Committee for working with the county to make this possible.
When I first heard of plans to build a homeless shelter in Corte Madera, I was very much opposed to it. It wasn't until I did a bunch of research on my own that I began to realize that permanent supportive housing can be an important solution to the homeless issue we have here in Marin County.
A safe home helps transform lives and creates essential stability, healing, independence, and dignity founded on hope. Our partnership with Marin County through Project Homekey and Homekey impacts many lives. Together, we strive to end homelessness in Marin.
From Corte Madera to Novato, Larkspur to Inverness, we have successfully housed hundreds of our community's most vulnerable, chronically homeless people. Because of projects like this and the support of community members like you, I know we can reach our goal of being the first county in the Bay Area to end chronic homelessness.
One of the ideas we had was to create welcome baskets that could be given to each new resident when they move in. So we sent people shopping for everything from toothpaste to shampoo to snacks, cozy slippers, and grocery store gift cards. And the response from the community was frankly overwhelming. So many people wanted to be a part of this. It really embodies the spirit of Corte Madera as a welcoming place.
So on behalf of Corte Madera, I'd like to welcome our newest residents.
Welcome to Corte Madera!
So as you can see, this project really has been embraced by the community. And, I don't think Scott would mind me saying this. I think people that were at one time really were concerned and opposed to this project have now come to actually really embrace it and see it as part of the solution. And really this group, and I think we could see this, with Homekey 2.0, they really see this community advisory group as being a model for other housing projects, permanent supportive housing projects in our community, as well as all across the country, of how communities can really come around and embrace these sites. So I just wanted to let everyone know that had been happening as a follow-up to Homekey 1.0. So Homekey 2.0. So it is important to note there is actually no official Homekey 2.0 yet. Earlier this year, the governor proposed an additional $750 million in the budget for a Homekey 2.0. The legislature has not taken action on that yet, but we are expecting that it could happen as soon as next month. And because of that, and because of the speed of the original Homekey process, we're just acting as though, planning as though a NOFA could come out as early as next month. And really the reason we wanted to have these sessions is because we don't want to be on our heels like last time. We really want to be proactive and get out in front of this and make sure that the community is aware and that they're able to provide information and feedback about the process. But again, because there is no Homekey 2.0, everything that you're going to hear, we're making assumptions based on the programmatic guidelines from Homekey 1.0. So what do we know from Homekey 1.0? So the first is that cities, counties, housing authorities, even tribal governments can be or need to be the lead applicant. There can be other co-applicants like nonprofit housing developers, even for-profit housing developers, social service providers, but it really needs to be led by a governmental entity. We're expecting, like last time, that the funding will be very flexible for the acquisition of hotels, motels, or other commercial sites. There are also projects that involved purchasing trailers or purchasing even tiny homes. So that could be a model that's pursued. And then we're also assuming that the same kind of timing. So we're going to have to close on these projects by the end of 2021, and they're going to have to be 50% occupied within 90 days. So just to like contextualize that means that we couldn't just have a blank or an empty piece of land and then have to build something brand new. These really have to be sites where you can rapidly move people in and close the process for sale rapidly. And then the final thing that I haven't touched on yet is really that local funding match requirement. So this is important. So I wanted to break it out into its own slide. So the way that the subsidy works is that it's on a per unit acquisition basis. So if the per unit cost of a building for the first $100,000, the state through Homekey fully subsidizes the cost of the unit. For the next $100,000 to $200,000, it's a 1-to-1 match, state to local. And then for $200,000 to $350,000, it's a 1-to-2 match. So the state would be $50,000, the local would be $100,000. So to fully max out the state subsidy or grant, a unit or the per unit acquisition cost would be up to $350,000. A project could certainly exceed that, but at that point, the local community would be 100% on the hook for providing that per unit acquisition cost. So to make this very concrete, you can see that if there was a project, let's say 50 units, that was $200,000 per unit, we would have to contribute $50,000 per unit locally, or about $2.5 million. If that acquisition cost went up to just by $90,000 to $290,000, our contribution per unit would go up to $110,000, and we would have to pay $5.5 million for this site. So this goes back to what I was talking about earlier about the whole formation of Opening Doors Marin, which is that we just don't have significant local monies, local capital for this type of match. And so that's why the Homekey grant has been so important to bringing money to our community, but it's also something we have to be mindful of moving forward, that we can actually afford these projects. So that leads to our kind of draft local criteria. And this is where we'd really love your feedback through the survey. So first and foremost, we're looking for projects that are not in areas of concentrated poverty. And so there are two reasons for that. One is just, I think ethically, we're trying to avoid over concentrating projects in areas that already have lower incomes. And so that's just something in terms of, our commitment to equity in terms of our homeless system of care that we're pursuing. There's also an operational aspect of this that's important, which is that the way that we finance a lot of these projects is by putting housing vouchers associated with the rooms in the building. So basically what's important to know about Section 8 or housing vouchers is that it's not free housing. Basically, if someone gets a voucher, they contribute 30% of their income towards housing, whatever their income is, and then the voucher covers the difference up to market rate. And so what that means is that if we're able to use vouchers for financing these units, then we have an income stream that can pay for the operations. So that looks like property management, even security in some cases. and it also pays for the services. So again, we've had such great results because people have wraparound services. So that's a key part of making this successful. We also want to, like Homekey 1.0, with our application, we want to have geographically distributed projects throughout the county. The goal is not to crowd all of our Homekey sites into one community. So that's an important factor. We also want to try to make sure that we have the participation from nonprofit developers. And why is that important? So the Homekey funding is for acquisition. It's not necessarily for rehabilitation. So the 3301 Kerner site, for example, is going to need significant rehabilitation to turn it into residential housing from a commercial use. And in order to access money for the rehab, we're relying pretty much, I don't want to say exclusively, but we're significantly relying on tax credit financing, which is a process for financing affordable housing. And that's something that nonprofit developers are able to do for us. So the idea is basically acquire with Homekey funding, rehab using tax credits to whatever extent possible. And so that's why we need nonprofit developers involved. And for nonprofit developers, they need projects that are of a certain scale in order to make it work financially for them. And typically for most of the nonprofit developers that we've been talking to, that's a minimum of about 45 units. Now, I don't want to say that that's like a hard cutoff, because obviously every project can have different financing, and I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A. And then there's some developers have signaled that they might be able to do smaller, but it is kind of our working constraint of targeting projects that are about 45 units or larger. Additionally, as you saw earlier, based on the subsidy breakdown, we are looking for projects that are less than $350,000 per unit for acquisition, and ideally less than $250,000. And then lastly, we want to make sure that these sites are not just in the middle of nowhere. The state grant last time actually didn't require, but there were points awarded for connection to services like grocery, transit, healthcare. So we're also looking for projects that are integrated within the community. So in terms of next steps, we're hosting 10 of these info sessions. This is the 6th. So there are 4 more this week. And then even since I created this slide, we've gotten the request to do this presentation in other settings. Next week, we'll be doing it for the Nevada City Council, for example. Also coming up, the county is going to be releasing a formal request for interest. So this would be to property sellers or property owners that might be interested in participating. Through the survey and through the info sessions, we're trying to further refine our local criteria for what types of projects to apply for. And then as projects are coming in, we're reviewing them around, are they actually for sale? How much are they? What's the actual selling cost? Could they be occupied? So doing a lot of that due diligence and basically getting ready for a possible NOFA from the state, again, as early as next month. So I'm going to show, I've got a short survey. I'm going to copy the link into the chat. The link is right here. But basically, if you want to start typing it in, or again, I'll put it in the chat. But basically, we're looking for your feedback on the general criteria that we're using for applying for projects. What are criteria that would make you excited about a Homekey site, or maybe have a little bit of pause. And then also, if you have actual ideas for projects, we'd be looking for that as well. So I'm going to stop sharing. That concludes the presentation. And then maybe Carrie, if you want to kick off, if there's any Q&A or questions that are coming in. If you want to field that, and then I'll copy this link for everyone. So thank you so much for listening to that. And I'll turn it over to Carrie.
Yeah, so we had one question come in about the minimum unit threshold, and that was right before Andrew went into the minimum unit threshold. But I did want to expand on that a little bit. So, Andrew mentioned that we're sort of looking at like around minimum 45 to sort of get the interest of the nonprofit housing developers. There's also the nature of services is that they scale. And so because services would be funded with vouchers, the site-based vouchers, we would need, even if there wasn't a nonprofit developer involved, we would need a certain sort of minimum number of units to make those services pencil out. So I think, for that also, we'd be looking at minimum sort of 35, 40. And then also in terms of the renovation costs, there's a lot of variation, I think, in renovation costs that are good to sort of keep in mind. If turning a commercial building into housing is going to be a lot more expensive than just like adding kitchenettes to a hotel. And so that would really change, I think, that balance of how many units would be necessary to fund the renovations. So that's, we're not encouraging anybody to try and do that math on their own. Certainly, like if you have units that are a property that you think would be good, let us know. We're happy to look into it. But just something to consider.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Carrie. I saw the next question is, can you provide information about the presentation of the Novato City Council? I believe their council meeting is next Tuesday. I think Mayor Eklund might actually be attending today. So Mayor Eklund, if you have any additional information you'd want to share in the chat, but I believe that is just next Tuesday evening. So I don't have the exact information, but I can try to pull it up while we're talking, or Carrie, if you want to look it up and maybe drop it in the chat. And then another question from, looks like Sean, would a long-term ground lease be of interest, and would it lower the cost curve per the specs guidelines described? Long-term ground leases, I think, were an allowable use of the Homekey funding. I think it would have to be a 10-year lease, if I recall. The state was really wanting to make sure that there was a long-term path to making sure that this is affordable housing. So it wasn't really meant to be something where it would work for 5 years, even 10 years. They wanted us to make sure that we had a path to long-term affordability and to make sure that these were staying housing units. So if you have ideas for a specific project that might involve a ground lease, I would certainly encourage you to submit it through the survey, and then we could talk more about what that might look like. And I did post that in the chat if people didn't see it, the link to the survey. And then Sean said, I'm thinking like 30 to 40 years, like what I've seen in Hawaii. Yeah, I mean, again, it could definitely possibly work. The other thing that I think is just, this isn't unique to Homekey, but I would say it's kind of a general, I would say, philosophy maybe that we're pursuing with affordable housing, which is that to whatever extent possible, if we can try to keep, I think the leases work well, but I think if we can try to have a nonprofit owner, then a lot of that equity and that revenue is coming back to us in the form of services and operational funding. So I think that's just a consideration as we think about, are we having a long-term lease with a property owner, or are we trying to bring that project into our portfolio? And then if that's the case, like, a lot of projects that have place-based vouchers on the units, that provides essentially service and operation funding into perpetuity. And so I think that's just something that we would want to think about. But again, feel free to submit your idea. And it looks like Carrie dropped the Novato info, and Mayor Eklund did as well, some information about the Novato meeting that's coming up. So thank you both for that. And then Linda's asking, what is included in, quote, supportive services? In your experience, do the supports change over time? How is the support financed over time? Carrie, do you want to maybe take that, talk a little bit about services?
Sure, yeah. So services at a site-based project like this would include, it depends on the size of the project and sort of the layout of the building, but generally it would include things like the case management for the people who are in the program. It would include, building maintenance type services. So upkeep for the building, any sort of, groundskeeping, repairs. It would include, usually there will be one sort of on-site person who lives at the project. One of the units is sort of designated for that, sort of like a super sort of position. The support, so the support is financed over time through those vouchers. And because the vouchers are sort of tied to the property, if somebody moves out, that's fine. The voucher stays there. You just move another person in and the unit is still supported. Because the rate of those vouchers is tied to rental prices, at least, in the Bay Area. We feel pretty confident that they'll remain pretty valuable vouchers for some time. So the support is just sort of ongoing because there's that financing. I'm trying to think of any other services. A lot of the time there'll be sort of some lighter touch, more communal services. So, people who sort of work on like activities for folks to do, or help to connect people to outside services. Security is one of those things. That's another thing that fits under the operations costs. So those are sort of the typical services and how they're financed.
Great, thanks, Carrie. Great. Well, any other questions? If people are maybe thinking about other possible questions, and just so everyone knows, this isn't a bad thing. These have been usually only lasting until for about 45 minutes. So if you don't have any questions, that's fine as well. I would add one thing that's come up in a lot of the sessions is, people want to get involved or, kind of what's the next step. One thing that we've also been sharing is, again, our goal with this is to really try to have as much community engagement in advance as possible. And so if you want us to maybe host another one of these sessions, if you have a group, I'm happy to try to, talk about that, or so we really just want to get the word out about this opportunity. I do see a question from Mayor Eklund. How many units are there in the Casa Buena? Carrie, I believe it's 18 housing units and then plus a manager's unit, right? So 19 total? Okay.
Yep. Yeah, and so that, I think, to be really frank with folks, that is sort of an example of a project that we're finding is a little bit too small. We're making the math pencil out, but it's not like a fully self-sufficient project. We're going to have to bring in some sort of external services from other funding sources. So I think that's actually one of the things we're trying to avoid with the new sort of requirements about a number of units.
Yeah, that's a great point. So yes, I think probably moving forward, that was, very much on the low end of what's feasible. Linda has a follow-up asking about services for people that are chronically homeless and the connection with behavioral health or mental illness. So I'll maybe add to what Carrie said earlier and just said, I think what's kind of amazing about the Housing First methodology is that despite underlying conditions that people might have, so everyone that's chronically homeless by definition has a disabling condition. Some people have multiple disabling conditions, but those things can range from physical health issues, behavioral health issues, substance abuse disorders, traumatic brain injuries. So despite that diversity of underlying whatever that person might be contending with, Housing First actually works well for almost everyone. And so once people are inside, those services are really, they're obviously adapted to each person, but you'd have the same kind of case manager working with a caseload of people with different challenges. And that case manager is helping them basically, again, thrive in that housing in terms of, adjusting to living inside, getting up to speed on kind of their activities of daily living once they're inside, connecting them with other support services. So maybe if a case manager is not their primary, obviously they're not their primary care physician, but like making sure that person is getting to healthcare appointments, making sure that person is getting to behavioral health appointments if there's a specialist involved. So really what we find is that the supportive services are meant to help anyone. They're not carved out for specific subpopulations. And that was something that we learned through our tours that I mentioned, is that when you create these kind of carved out programs, you end up making a more complicated system than it needs to be. And so that's why we really find that Housing First just works for most people. Anything to add to that, Carrie? Yeah, so
the only thing I would add, I totally agree with everything Andrew just said. I'd also just add that there's a lot of research about Housing First as an approach. It's something that's been practiced for 20 years now, 30 years now maybe. And all the research shows that Housing First doesn't require participation in mental health services. If somebody has mental illness and is unable to, is unwilling to get treatment for that mental illness, they still get housed. The case manager still works with them on sort of, mitigating any sort of impacts of that mental illness on their ability to be stably housed. But the research shows that there's just enormous increases in people engaging with mental health services, and actually higher increases in housing first than in mental health programs that require participation in mental health services. Same thing with substance use issues. So it's a really effective strategy, and results in, much higher housing retention, much higher participation in services. So that's sort of our approach, and the reasoning behind it.
Absolutely. Great. Any other questions from anyone? Okay, good. Well, Carrie, unless I've forgotten anything, I think we might wrap this up. We did get a comment just in the chat about again, just participation with Novato and the city council. So please make sure to check out that information. I think that'd be a great way to share more feedback in Novato specifically about your thoughts about Homekey, which is coming up next week. And with that, I will be sending out slides from today's presentation, as well as the recording of the presentation. I'll likely do that probably on Thursday or Friday. And then that way I'll be emailing everyone that attended presentations this week. So if you want to see the slides or anything like that, they will be coming soon. So with that, I'll just final copy of the link to the survey. If you want to click on that, if you have any final thoughts you want to add, and again, feel free to share this wider than folks that attended today. And we really appreciate your time. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody.